They call the police, they call 911 and they report baby Joe missing. And they're trying to take a missing persons report and they say he takes off in his red vehicle. So, what's the significance of that? If you're a law enforcement officer, an investigator, what does that tell you?
And Jeanette, thanks for having me. Such a sad case, and we've seen a lot of them here on the Law and Crime Network, but this one just really breaks my heart. Baby Joe, nonverbal and autistic. You know what law enforcement sees here is a father, Joseph, who is not taking the steps that one reasonably would had his or her child disappeared. You know, and this is just the beginning of many inconsistent stories. First is a child wandering off. Obviously, then we have the confession later on that's recanted, and ultimately what a story transitions to, which is mom, Crystal, suffocating the boy using a pillow. So this is the beginning of the investigation. And some prosecutors, many prosecutors actually, like to start at the beginning. And that's what they're presenting to the jury, those first law enforcement officers that showed up at the scene.
Yeah, it certainly does seem suspicious that, you're a father who's called 911 and that while the missing persons report is being taken, that you would leave. Nima, I think it's very suspicious. If you're a parent, you want to do everything you can to find your child. And we don't know why Joe Daniels left in his vehicle that night, but it just doesn't seem, it seems very suspicious that you would leave the home when law enforcement is there and they want to take a missing persons report and they need to find this child.
No question, Anjanette. And we don't really know what the defense theory of the case is. I mean, there's so much bad evidence here, starting with that confession, but this is equally bad. You know, you have a father who's lost a child, not just a child, a special needs child who really deserves the parents' protection more than anyone. And instead of acting concerned, he takes off. So this is going to be a problem for the defense, just like a lot of the evidence in this case. So it's going to be interesting to see what direction defense counsel goes in. Seems like, at least during cross examination, they may be arguing that baby Joe just took off, and because he's attracted
Mhm.
to bright colors. Unlikely to win the day there, even though there's no body, especially when there's a confession.
Yeah, and even if a 5, 6 year old child, takes off, a child with special needs, as you mentioned, autism, takes off, if something terrible happens, you're eventually going to sadly come upon a body. I mean, I guess it's possible. You could argue maybe somebody took the child. What we just don't know where the defense is going to go with this, other than they're going to say there was a false confession. So it does seem very very odd to me. And the fact that they haven't ever found the body is very strange too. We've seen cases where they've won convictions without a body, but do you think it will be incredibly difficult in this case? Because if he falsely confessed, you would have expected, or if he confessed, as the prosecution contends, the defense says he falsely confessed, you would think they would have found a body.
Yeah, I think they would have found the body. And interesting, during that confession, Joseph took law enforcement into the woods, but he was unable to find the body. Now that confession hasn't been suppressed; it's coming in, as well as the jail calls where Joseph admits that baby Joe is dead, but instead of taking responsibility, it seems to point the finger at Crystal, the mom. So I don't think there's any question that baby Joe is dead. It's just, what is this defendant going to try to argue to the jury in light of the confession and those jail calls? Another bad evidence in this case.
Yeah, definitely not good facts for the defense. So it'll be interesting to see where they take this. Nima, what do you think? Do you think that we're going to hear anything from Crystal in this case? She's also charged with endangerment, neglect. Obviously, they did not play what she said in the body camera video because that would basically be her testifying.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Those trials have been severed. We know that they're going to point the finger at one another because Joseph already has. And normally those types of admissions come in because she's a defendant, but because she's not subject to cross examination, it would be improper to put Crystal's statements in the case in chief against Joseph. So that's why the court said this is a redacted version of the body cam. It's not the full video.
Nima, how complicated does the case get when you have a defendant who has these mental health issues?
It is complicated, Anjanette, and this was the subject of pretrial motions. Specifically, there's a psych report, and the defense wants to argue that Joseph has these mental health issues, and he was more susceptible to making a false confession, even though he didn't actually murder baby Joe. And now the prosecution wants to cross-examine either the psychiatrist or psychologist or the defendant himself if he were to actually testify with these health records. Not only that, but also use them in the state's case in chief because they've argued now in opening that the defense has opened the door to the defendant's mental health, and it's only fair response for them to use these records.
Sure, most certainly. All right. Well, there's going to be some DNA evidence in this trial, and we want to listen to a little bit of the back and forth that went on today about that DNA evidence that we're going to hear about. Take a listen.
His body is not found that night. As you will see, it's never been found because the defendant has continued to conceal the location. The proof is going to show that the following morning, on April the 7th, the defendant admits to law enforcement that he lied about the location of the body. He didn't lie about killing Joe Clyde, but lied about the location of where he concealed the body. He then signs, after being Mirandized, a written confession saying that he killed Joe Clyde. The defendant is then taken to jail, and later that day, after several hours, he initiates a phone call. Not law enforcement, but the defendant makes a phone call to law enforcement and says he wants to provide some additional details. And what he tells law enforcement is that he had discarded the body by placing it in the trunk of the car, that he had driven to a truck stop approximately 9 miles away from his house. He stopped at the truck stop. The Joe Clyde's body was in the trunk of the car. He went into Love's, bought something, and then took the body and threw it off of a bridge. And they get the defendant out of the jail at his request and take him to multiple bridges to see if he can show them exactly which one. And he continues to lie. The defendant is then driven back over to the command center, which is still up and running. And it just so happens that Big Joe, the defendant's father, is back in town from his long-haul drive. TBI agent Brant Holt allows the defendant's father, Big Joe, to get in the vehicle with the defendant. And in the vehicle, the defendant tells his father, "I beat Joe Clyde."
Just some awful, awful things that we're listening to in this case. And poor baby Joe, his body has never been found. How hard is it going to be how hard is it going to be to prove that Joe Daniels, the father, murdered baby Joe by beating him to death when they say there's no DNA evidence of that either in the home or in the vehicle?
And Jeanette, you don't need DNA evidence when the defendant is caught in lie after lie after lie, consistently changing the story, and you have that confession. So the defense will always try to point to the lack of evidence or sloppy prosecution or whatever they can. But this is going to be a very, very difficult case to defend because, again, you have that confession, you have those admissions. And, we're talking about Joe's dad. He made the admission in the vehicle. He's also speaking to him on those recorded jail calls. And again, gives a completely different story, says that Crystal killed baby Joe. So, I don't know if the defense is just going to argue reasonable doubt or try to come up with a theory that baby Joe wandered off or ultimately try to put this all on Crystal. But, that lack of blood or DNA evidence, although it's something for the defense, it's certainly not enough to get an acquittal in this case.
That's interesting. And I do think it's interesting that you point out that maybe you don't always have DNA. He may have been bleeding from both sides of his mouth, but I think sometimes they try to make it out like some of these crimes, like there would have just been blood everywhere, and that's not necessarily the case, not to be too gruesome. So there are going to be some cases where you simply don't have the DNA, but it doesn't mean that something didn't happen. I do want to ask you, though, about that, what you mentioned and what the prosecutor mentioned in his opening statement. Joe Daniels getting into the vehicle and telling his father, "I beat baby Joe." That is pretty damning evidence, especially if they call dad to the stand, the grandfather of baby Joe, and he talks about this on the stand, which I would assume we're going to hear.
Very damning evidence. And usually, if you're the prosecution, the last thing you want to do is talk about evidence unless you intend to present it. That really causes problems with juror credibility. So I expect that evidence to come in. I expect those jail calls to come in. And again, just very difficult to defend this case. Going back to the DNA evidence engine, who knows where baby Joe allegedly urinated, where this beating happened. may not have been on the carpet, may have been on a rug, may have been on a hard surface that was cleaned up. Certainly, there's plenty of reasonable explanations for the state here as to why we don't have that blood or urine evidence.
Talk about this. Neema, I'm going to put this to you. What is the state's strategy there in that hearing, asking Dr. Afshi whether or not he had reviewed the other interviews? It sounds like he focused just on the one where there was an alleged confession to the crime.
And Jeanette, pretty effective cross-examination of a defense expert there, establishing that he hadn't reviewed the other admissions, the other confessions. He was there on a mission and a mission only to review the one most damning confession, which he surprisingly determined was coercion. So I like the strategy there by the state, and it's probably one of the reasons why the judge ruled that the confession was admissible. Going back to David's earlier point, I was also a former assistant U.S. attorney, and we would use these polygraphs all the time. And I don't remember a single instance where, in the hundreds that we did, where it either wasn't deception or inconclusive. I don't remember a defendant ever passing a polygraph, and usually we take that test result to the defendant, and lo and behold, he or she would come forward and accept responsibility. So really kind of junk science there, and that's why they're generally not admissible in these cases.
And talk about this along with David Katz. Neema, that seems pretty sloppy if they're saying, well, that's not blood. They should have at least maybe swabbed it. They didn't have DNA back then, but they certainly had serology where they could do blood typing. And just to write it off as not being blood seems pretty, I don't know, that just doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in me. And then to put somebody up on the stand to testify about their belief that they thought it was blood. What are your thoughts?
Well, Anjanette, David touched upon it. A lot of sloppy policing by New York law enforcement officers, at least with respect to the disappearance of Kathy Durst. But really effective cross-examination by DeGuerin there, as you said, one of the best, and Lewin too, one of the best cold case prosecutors here in Los Angeles. We're seeing a really heavyweight fight between two outstanding attorneys. But both of these attorneys, they need to tell this jury a story, not just because they're sitting there for 4 or 5 months here in LA, because the state, the district attorney's office in particular, they need some sort of theory of the case. And their theory of the case is that because of this suspicious blue light and this blood, that Bob Durst killed Kathy, his wife, and then because of that, it set off a chain reaction where Susan Berman died, then Morris Black died, all at the hands of Robert Durst. So this is really important evidence here because the state doesn't have a whole lot. It's a purely circumstantial case, aside from a few admissions in the jinx and that cadaver letter. So this is all very, very important evidence for the jury to hear. And the fact that the housekeeper saw blood, that is important evidence. And I think the state scored a few points here. And they're going to take that sloppy law enforcement investigation argument and they're going to run with it, just like the defense is going to say, well, law enforcement didn't think there was anything here, and Kathy just disappeared because of either drug use or just being mentally unstable.
Sure. But was it blood? We don't know. Maybe it was ketchup. Who knows? But the housekeeper thought it was blood. The police didn't take a sample. Right. Who made that call? Do you think it was Kathy or do you think it was Susan Berman?
I personally, as a former federal prosecutor, think it was Susan Berman. I like the points that the prosecution made, that Susan wouldn't have called the dean of the school, would have called her direct supervisor, wouldn't have called out on the first day of a rotation unless she was gravely ill. And she wouldn't have communicated those really sort of personal issues that she was having with respect to cramping and headaches and so forth to the dean of the school. So I believe, Lewin, here, that it was someone else, and most likely Susan Berman, not Kathy Durst, who made that phone call.